All right, so here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Open and Equitable Scholarship in the Liberal Arts Lecture Series. The lecture today will be by Dr. Miriam Posner. It is co-sponsored by the Oberlin Group Libraries Open and Equitable Scholarship Working Group and the Colgate University Horizon Series. We're going to be following the Oberlin Group Libraries Code of Conduct, which Josh is going to put in the chat, which should appear momentarily. And I'm Mike Roy. I'm from Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, and I'm the host for the lecture today. I'm joined by my colleague Josh Finnell at Colgate University, who's going to help me monitor the Q&A. We are both members of the Oberlin Group Libraries Open and Equitable Scholarship in the Liberal Arts Working Group. The members of this group share a belief that scholarship and data should be universally accessible and equally available to scholars and readers worldwide. I'm going to just go over a few housekeeping notes. We're going to have time for questions at the end, and you can write your questions using the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to ask questions as the presentation progresses and to tweet your thoughts about the lecture using the hashtag #OberlinGroupOpen, which Josh is also going to paste into the chat. Josh and I will be moderating the questions, and we will field them at the end. If you have any technical or other issues, just direct chat with either me or to Josh. If you'd like to listen to a live transcript, you can navigate to the bottom of the screen where you'll see a closed captioning icon and then add the show live transcript. A recording of the lecture will be made available on the lecture series website under past lectures, and we'll also email you the link to it as a registrant. So having gotten through all the housekeeping, I'm very pleased to introduce Miriam Posner, who's an assistant professor at the UCLA School of Information. She's also a digital humanist with interests in labor, race, feminism, and history and philosophy of data. As a digital humanist, she's particularly interested in the visualization of large bodies of data from cultural heritage institutions and the application of digital methods to the analysis of images and video. A film, media, and American studies scholar by training, she frequently writes on the application of digital methods to the humanities. She's at work on two projects. The first is what does data mean for humanistic research? And the second, a most timely topic, is how multinational corporations are making use of data in their supply chains. Her talk today is entitled Data Trouble. Thanks to Miriam for discussing the benefits of open scholarship with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Miriam.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for those of you who came for, giving up some precious afternoon hours to be with me. It's a real honor. I'd love to know where you're sitting. If you wanted to enter into the chat, like your location, that would be welcome. I myself am sitting in Los Angeles. Hello, Matthew and Sue. So really, people are coming from all over. That's great. So as I mentioned, I myself am in Los Angeles, and as such, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tovaangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanukvatam, the ancestors, the Ahihiram, the elders, and Iyu Hinkum, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. And it's really wonderful to see you all filtering in from all across the country. So I wanted to speak today about an issue that concerns all of us, really, and namely whether there is a specifically humanist way of working with data. And part of what initially got me thinking about this was watching data management librarians talk to humanists about like backing up their data, putting it in a repository. And it seemed like they were speaking different languages. The librarians, insisted that these scholars had data, while the scholars suggested that the librarians actually had no idea what they were talking about because they had no data. And it's a bit puzzling because it's not as though humanists reject the notion of data outright. Most humanists I know wouldn't have a problem believing that global climate data means we're experiencing global warming, for example. And I can't imagine, excuse me, just taking a moment to share my screen. I forgot to do that at the beginning. I'm gonna share sound as well. Okay, now we should be good. And I can't imagine a humanities scholar saying we shouldn't look at something like poverty rates simply because, you know, it comes in the form of data. So the problem seems to raise itself specifically when someone proposes to treat humanities sources as data. I see there is a strong demand to make my image bigger, which is probably the only time anyone has ever asked for that. And we can see evidence of this kind of humanistic skepticism of data in pieces like Stephen Marsh's notorious 2012 essay for the Los Angeles Review of Books, Literature is Not Data. And in a 2015 survey of faculty at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which, quote, revealed weak identification with the word data, particularly among faculty at the College of Liberal Arts. In this case, many faculty preferred the term research materials. This is the kind of thing where I was hearing librarians and humanists talk past each other. Here's a graph that I realize is basically illegible to you. But the question for the faculty was, what do you call your stuff? Data or research materials? And you can see that in the psychology department, almost every faculty member chose to call their stuff data, while in the English department, every faculty member chose research materials. And it kind of varies depending on what discipline you're in. So economics is, they call their stuff data. Anthropology also chooses data. Writing studies, interestingly, is kind of half and half. So this data comes from Alicia Hofflich-Moore at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and huge thanks to her for sharing that with me. So, but anyway, this all got me thinking, like, if humanists tend not to think of their sources as data, why is that? And at first it seems like a straightforward question, but the more you consider it, the more it's a bit of a mind bender. Because for one thing, if you stick to prevailing definitions of data, it's actually hard to see what disqualifies humanities sources from being named by this term. So we'll go to the Oxford English Dictionary, as good humanists must, and we see that data has a couple different definitions. The first is related items of chiefly numerical information considered collectively, typically obtained by scientific work and used for reference, analysis, or calculation. A second definition has to do with computing. Quantities, characters, or symbols on which operations are performed by a computer considered collectively. Also, in non-technical contexts, information in digital form. It's a start, but I think both of these definitions are so vague that to me they're scarcely useful. It seems as though, according to the OED, data is something a computer can act upon, and it may be scientific, or it may not be, or maybe it's just information in digital form. So while this definition does what a dictionary should, which is capture the common use of this term, I don't think we can look to this set of definitions to fully account for the difference between research materials and data. The National Academy of Science offers an equally baffling definition. Data are facts, numbers, letters, and symbols that describe, an object, idea, condition, situation, or other factors. And this, again, does not really get us anywhere, since according to the definition, I mean, there's no particular reason humanities sources can't be data. Certainly a book, for example, describes an object, idea, condition, situation, or other factors. So if we look outside the dictionary and at scholarly efforts to define data, we get some intriguing and differently inflected definitions. So my colleague Johanna Drucker argues in Humanities Approaches to Graphical Display that we should actually reject the word data, whose Latin root means what is given, in favor of capta, to reflect that what we've called data is really just what we are able to capture from the real world, which I think is quite a compelling argument. But her focus here is visualization, and I find myself wanting to extend this distinction a little bit further to be more specific so that we can understand what makes capta capta. Like, what's the difference between capta and, for example, a work of art? And then my other colleague, Chris Boardman, provides a usefully nuanced definition in her book, Big Data, Little Data, No Data, noting that the right question to ask is not what is data, but instead when is data. And by this, she means that the dataness of any set of information may not inhere in any qualities of the set itself. So it's not the stuff itself that matters. It's the way that the scholar intends to use the stuff, which I think is quite perceptive and probably true. But I think then that we can pick up where Boardman leaves off. So if anything has the potential to be data, what is the distinction in use that marks a set of sources as data or not data? So like, what are we doing to the stuff to make it data? But of course, it's never that simple. For an answer to that question, it would seem to make sense to look at the scholarly methods particular to the humanities. But here again, we find ourselves in a bit of a morass, because if you go looking for definitions of the humanities, you'll find that they're actually pretty thin on the ground. There are many odes to the humanities, defenses of the humanities, arguments in favor of the humanities, but very few actual definitions of them. So we all together tend to talk about the humanities as though we all know what it is. But in fact, the constellation of disciplines that currently goes by that name has not been called the humanities for all that long. When the term humanities emerged in the 15th century, it referred largely to the study of ancient Greek and Latin. That is to say, to the study of human activities rather than theology, when those were your two options, thus the name. But sometime around World War II, the meaning of the humanities changed, so that rather than referring to simply the classics, the term humanities came to refer to all the spheres of learning concerned with human culture, which is to say history, literature, languages, philosophy, art, and music. And this is also the time when we get C.P. Snow's famous lecture on the two cultures, which again is iconic, but not all that precise. And this is more or less the definition that the National Endowment for the Humanities uses, a sort of grab bag of disciplines that at times actually seems to circle back on itself. So humanities refers to language, both modern and classical, linguistics, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history, criticism, and theory of the arts, those aspects of social sciences which have humanistic content and employ humanistic methods, which we actually don't know what those are, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to double back on itself and disclaim any responsibility for defining the thing it's purporting to define. Humanities is art, literature, the humanistic social sciences. It's the humanities, you know, the humanities. So the humanities deals with human cultural production. On that we can agree, but doesn't necessarily include a difference in method as well as in the subject of its scrutiny. That is to say, is the humanities distinct just because it looks at human cultural production or because it looks at it in a certain way? Well, it's not clear from the NEH's definition, although I think that many of us would agree that there is something distinctive about the humanities, even if it's just devaluation in the current labor market. But why does it matter? Like why spend all this time parsing definitions? Because like porn, we know the humanities when we see it. So must we really contort ourselves to find a definition? I'm usually like not that interested myself in definitions, but I think we're at a point where it actually does matter. And I want to use a particular example to explain why we need to get better at articulating the particular methods of the humanities. So my contention to you is that for many years, people from other disciplines have more or less left humanities sources to the humanists. So literature, art, movies, etc., let the humanities people deal with them. And that's why it was such a shock to so many people when this article, Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books, came out in 2011, not incidentally in the journal Science. Because the authors are scientists, linguists, and mathematicians, and they turn the statistical and computational tools of their disciplines on the products of human culture. So like our stuff, specifically 5 million books from Google's enormous corpus of English language works produced between 1800 and 2000. You may remember that they called what they were doing culturomics, a play on the word genomics. And they argue for the relevance of this new field to history, gender studies, the history of religion, and linguistics, among many other fields. Just a quick example of the kinds of arguments they were levying. So in diagram C, they argue that feminism made initial inroads first into France, but then took over in English-speaking countries in the 70s. And they can tell that because of the relative prominence of the two keywords. While in the second chart, how do they put it? In the battle of the sexes, the women are gaining ground on the men. So, and they tell that again, because they have, they've charted the relative prominence of two keywords. So people loved this, or at least the media did, but humans reacted with, humanists reacted with almost visceral distaste. And this was certainly something, but the graphs and charts and statistical takeaways bore more resemblance to Trivial Pursuit answers than anything that I recognized as humanistic scholarship. We didn't like it, we didn't trust it, we didn't want it. And for all the author's enthusiasm about opening up new windows on human culture, humanists, almost to the person, reacted by ignoring it and hoping culturomics would just quietly sidle back to the lab that it escaped from. So what was our big problem? Couldn't we just be happy for these enterprising and hardworking scientists? And no, we cannot be. We are not happy for them. And I think we're at a place where we need to do a better job articulating why. We find ourselves at a moment where the study of human cultural production, stuff like novels and poetry, art and literature, used to be the sole province of humanists because no one else really cared. But with mass digitization of the cultural record, suddenly other people from other disciplines do care, and they're excited to turn the methods of their disciplines on stuff that used to belong only to humanists. So our earlier kind of lackadaisical approach to defining the humanities, and in which we used to define the field in terms of the stuff that it studied, is clearly no longer fully sufficient. And at the same time, we haven't really articulated why the way we study this stuff matters as much as the stuff we study. And that's why I had such a hard time finding a definition of the humanities. It's because one doesn't really exist. And that's what makes possible a situation like culturomics, where scientists can amble onto the stage using statistical techniques on the human record and be like, you're welcome, we solved it, we solved culture, we solved it for you. So I think now is the time for humanists to articulate why some of the techniques don't fully do justice to the things we value, because otherwise we're at serious risk of looking for all the layperson can tell, like incompetent scientists. So what exactly is the source of this humanist unease with data-driven work trained on the human cultural record? And is it worth taking seriously? Sometimes people will say that the issue is positivism, by which they mean that big data projects like culturomics consider only those phenomena that can be recorded empirically, and they dismiss all speculation and interpretation. That is to say, the culturomics group has naively mistaken recorded data for reality. I do think that's an issue here, but I don't think that it gets at the entirety of the problem the way we might like it to. The scientists involved in the project are pretty clear that they intend their work to be a starting point for interpretation and not the end product. And you can see this in a quote from Lieberman Ada, who says, "I don't want humanists to accept any specific claims. We're just throwing a lot of interesting pieces on the table. The question is, are you willing to examine the data?" And no is the answer. we are not willing or interested to examine that particular data. That's not to say that there aren't digital humanists who do large scale work with many texts, but I don't know of any humanist who actually has used the culturomics work as a starting point for anything except as a critique. And in any case, humanists of most stripes believe that some kind of ground truth exists somewhere. It's the rare humanist that believes absolutely everything is relative, although of course they do exist. We use evidence all the time, and we certainly believe that evidence can prove an argument right or wrong. Otherwise, we wouldn't spend so much time in archives. It's just that culturomics data was clearly the wrong evidence for us. So, was it something else? Well, humanists tend to prize close reading, by which I mean carefully interpreting smaller pieces of evidence in order to make arguments. And people often raise this fondness for close reading as a possible reason that humanists haven't trusted big data projects. And again, I think this is important, but not the entire issue. I can see a humanities scholar arguing for the unique value of close reading, but I can't see her entirely rejecting, for example, the notion of genre scholarship, in which a scholar looks at an entire genre, because close reading has never been the only tool humanists use. We look at stuff at scale all the time. There's a venerable tradition in history of examining the longue durée, and we just don't seem to like to do this interpretive work via data sets. So a preference for close reading and an aversion to positivism, I think, are certainly important, but I don't think they tell the whole story. The real problem, I'm going to argue, I think lies with some fundamental assumptions that get activated as soon as you propose to treat a source as data. And perhaps counterintuitively, an examination of an object of intense negotiation which is to say, in this case, data can tell us a lot about what the community values and how it sees itself. So in other words, I'm trying to get at a definition of the humanities by showing how it differs from methods that treat sources as data. So in what follows, I'm going to articulate several problems that data pose for the humanist. And I think that these problems pose some hard questions about whether data-driven humanities work is possible in the humanities as it currently exists. Which is not to say that these aspects are insurmountable. It's more that they pose a real epistemological problem for humanities scholars, which also happens to be very interesting. And I'll annoy you by issuing one more disclaimer before I get to the real substance here, which is that I am not really telling data scientists and database experts anything that they don't know. In my experience, these data experts are extremely attuned to these issues with data, and they actively discuss how to control for them. So data people, I know you know this. I'm just being explicit about some assumptions that I think have troubled humanists. Okay, so again, the question I am asking is, what exactly does a data-driven methodology pose as a problem for the humanist? So first, when you treat a source as data, the boundaries of each record must be demarcated in some way. Information cannot exist as an undifferentiated mass if we're going to perform computational operations on it, even if you perform those operations by hand. And yet, humanists tend not to see events, objects, or even people as cleanly disconnected from one another, certainly not in a predictable way. One of the culturomics diagrams gave us information about the dates on which the telephone, radio, and other media were invented. Well, the very word invention, if you've ever mentioned it to a historian of science, tends to make them squirm, because it suggests that objects are cut cleanly from whole cloth, like they weren't here one day and then they were here the next. But we see individual technologies as emerging from constellations of forces, not as suddenly appearing like thunderbolts. And, you know, if you want to get technical, in fact, we tend not to think of various pieces of technology as separate in and of themselves. The notion of remediation, which is very important to media scholars, suggests that previous technologies are always built in to the technologies that precede them, in the way, for example, that cinema swallowed many of the attributes of vaudeville and television swallowed many of the attributes of cinema, and on and on. So these things are not really separate. They're all connected in a much messier way than the diagram might have you believe. Or to give you another example, a database I built a few years ago required me to construct separate fields for film screenwriters, photographers, and directors, which is something that makes a lot of sense to do for the golden age of Hollywood. But that same separation of roles doesn't hold true for the early silent era. A lot of times, like, the director was not even a thing that existed. And yet somehow I wanted to track these roles over time, but they're not really the same thing. So it was very confusing. And if you're thinking about text analysis, I think that I would argue that tokenization is another form of demarcation. I imagine we're all familiar with the argument that you can't understand a work of prose as a bag of words, because the way that the words connect to each other matters too. There's a closely related issue that has to do with whether one data point can sensibly be measured against another. When is it okay to say that one thing is equivalent to another thing, or precedes another thing, or outweighs another thing? We need some sort of standard scale of measurement for our data, a process that Johanna Drucker calls parameterization. So to give one example, we know when we think about the way we experience our lives that time doesn't operate the same way for everyone and at all moments. When you're experiencing something really uncomfortable, time seems to stretch on forever. While this talk, on the other hand, is like flashing before your eyes because it's incredibly enjoyable and you can't believe that 32 minutes have already passed. So we register time in many different ways, but in order to place it on a scale, we need to apply standardized measurements to it. This feels strange, I think, to people who are interested in the particularity of human experience, because it seems to deny that different people can experience the same thing in different ways. And if you want to, you can see some of this weirdness in action with the venerable project, Digital Harlem, which claims to display the everyday lives of people who lived in Harlem in the 1930s. You know, maybe it does, but for whom does a card game occupy the same register of experience as the murder of a spouse? The two experiences are not equivalent, and yet they have to be made to fit the same order of thing if they're going to be jointly displayed on a map. It's perhaps my favorite one. The term ontology can mean many different things. In philosophy, it often refers to like the basic essence of something, while in computer science and information science, ontology usually refers to the way that you organize entities in order to create a data model. But I like this confusing aspect of the word because I think it gets at an important property of the term, and that's that the way we divide the world into categories does express something fundamental about the way we see the world. And one person's ontology often won't make sense for another person. Now, databases are designed to stabilize relationships, even if just for a moment, because otherwise we can't predictively retrieve information from them. But when humanists think about the way things are connected to each other, they're trained to be really attentive to the way these connections change depending on who's doing the looking. And one way you can kind of observe this in action is watching the case of indigenous communities trying to make their cultural materials retrievable in libraries and archives. This is a quote from one of the catalogers. Have you ever noticed how American Indians are treated in Library of Congress cataloging? In both obvious and subtle ways, American Indians are treated as a remnant of the past. And that's because most cultural institutions classify indigenous artifacts under the single heading of antiquities. And this makes perfect sense if you're a colonial administrator, but if you're a member of an indigenous community, your stuff is very much not antique. And so in response, we've seen a good number of alternate classification schemas arising from indigenous communities themselves. I think the Brian Deere classification system is probably the best known of these, but there are many of them and they're quite fascinating. So ontology is sort of the ground you walk on or the air you breathe. It's the basic assumptions you make about how you should understand the world. Scientists have many disputes about many things, but I do think that they tend to have a shared understanding of the terms of their debate. Humanists love to change the terms of the debate. It's our specialty. And not just because we're sneaky, but because we think it's important, if you're representing human culture, to understand that not every human experiences the world in the same way. So standardized models of the world become very troublesome in this context. You know, if we want our ontology to stick, it's very difficult to apply it across, for example, two cultures or two genders. Replicability is where I think I saw the humanists and librarians speaking most past each other. Because in the sciences, it's become really important for repositories to collect not just scientific studies, but of course their underlying data as well, so that scientists can replicate experiments and thus check their veracity. And it's one great benefit of well-structured and described data, this ability to independently verify results. But I think that this logic is completely unintelligible to most humanities scholars. And that's why I saw these standoffs between librarians and humanists where neither could make sense of what the other was saying. Because we would never expect two different people to look at the same book and come to the same conclusion about what it means, ever. It's not that interpretation is personal, although it sort of is, so much as that the interpretation is the work. It's very rare, actually, that someone disputes that you saw what you said you saw, just that you were wrong in the meaning that you ascribed to the thing that you saw. So the very idea that one person's research might replicate another's suggests to the humanities scholar that the person asking us to replicate our work just fundamentally doesn't understand what we're doing. If you're a historian or cultural scholar, you bring to your work the knowledge that history contains a plenitude that is impossible to replicate. We cannot know everything that happened in the past because the historical record is so partial and incomplete. But we have ways of dealing with that necessary incompleteness in humanities scholarship. We can talk about gaps in the archives, the contingencies of the historical record, the voices that tended not to be recorded. And you can watch how a historian does this. Saadia Hartman famously does it in her 2019 book. She's carefully scrutinizing evidence of young women's lives in the 19th century. And she says explicitly, I've pressed at the limits of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been, imagined the things whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility, moments when the vision and dreams of the wayward seemed possible. But while humanists are allowed to do this, we don't have a programmatic or visual vocabulary for talking about what's not in a data set. And so to a historian, a data set seems to boast of a definitiveness that it should not claim. Even if the data set is explicitly a sample, it purports to be representative, or like it wouldn't be valid. Why would you use it? A data set has to be bounded because otherwise, like Borges's map, a data set would sprawl beyond even our own advanced ability to manage it. But historical phenomena are not bounded in that way. We're getting close to the end of my list, I promise. Okay, so historical and cultural artifacts rarely present themselves in isolation. Rather, they're bound up with a format and context that itself carries meaning. For example, this advertisement from an early race film contains information about the cast of the film, which may be what you're interested in as you take notes. But of course, that's not all that the ad contains. The pictures, the language, the paper it was printed on, even the way that the newspaper has crumbled over the years, all of these things could matter. And yet to assimilate data points into a coherent whole, one has to remove the data from its distracting context. So denuded in this way, data means something. It definitely means something, but it doesn't mean the same thing that it used to. Now, no scholar, of course, could capture every aspect of her source material in a scholarly work, but in examining example after example of the source material in context, the scholar does hope to notice something that others wouldn't have thought to record, that would never have been recorded as data because no one thought it was important enough to document. So a data set, in a way, I think looks naked to a humanities scholar. Noteworthy features are there, of course, but humanities scholarship is built on drawing our attention to the things we never thought to notice until someone pointed them out to us. So all of these operations that I've just mentioned are performed under the sign of categorization, which, you know, I want to argue is, if we're looking for a term at the heart of the humanistic skepticism about data, we could do worse than looking at categorization. It's been my experience that categorization is at the very essence of any attempt to create data. The world as it exists is a cacophony of phenomena, none of which is inherently categorized in any particular way. Of course, you know this. But in order to turn any of this mess into computable data, we do need to identify those parts of any object or phenomenon that are meaningful and then give labels to those attributes. For example, I could be classified as a woman, a scholar, a digital humanist, a mother, a brown-haired person, or any number of other things, depending on what you're interested in. The label we pick depends on the kind of thing we're interested in counting. And we do have to standardize these labels in order for them to be at all meaningful. So I may like to call myself a woman with an A, and you may like woman with a Y. But in order to have any kind of meaningful category to represent the idea of womanhood at large, we need to somehow standardize the label we're using, which is not to say we can't have synonyms and thesauri, but it does mean that at some level, things are being lumped together. We have to do this because if we don't categorize, we can't count a query. And if we can't count a query, we can't visualize. Looking at linked open data is sort of fascinating for that way because we know, like moving through the world, that gender is fluid and contradictory and multivalent. But DBpedia, unbeknownst to most people, has a single authority page for male and female where this stuff is non-negotiable. Skip this. Now, you could do something like what the scholars and librarians who have composed Homosaurus have done. They've created a linked data vocabulary meant to cover a much wider variety of gender and sexual identities than in other vocabularies. But of course, they're at a certain point finding themselves struggling with a similar problem, which is that we need to lump things together a little bit in order to count things meaningfully. But once we start lumping them, we lose specificity. And once we get too specific, it's very hard to know what any two things have in common. And yet, if we're going to work with data in any meaningful way, we have to do stuff like that, like creating authorities for gender and race, because we need to be able to aggregate and disaggregate data in order to make it anything other than a whole bunch of individual cells in a table. I don't think humanists really hate categories per se, but I think that good humanities scholarship does not take existing categories as its raw material. The whole point is to break existing categories by making new and unexpected connections. And the most powerful humanities scholarship is that which breaks the categories that seem absolutely the most natural to us, like the kind of work that blows your head apart, asks you to question things that you never thought to question before. Things like man or woman, black or white, human or non-human. So we're using evidence for sure, like Saadia Hartman uses evidence, but to build new ontological frameworks, not for the most part to fill in gaps on a timeline, the way that the Culturomics team did. Well, this may make it sound as though I hate data, but of course that's not actually the case. I find it fascinating and work with it all the time. It's just that I think that those of us who are interested in using data for humanistic work could benefit from thinking of different methods for working with and communicating with it. So I'm really interested going forward in finding ways to think about and represent data that are congenial to the knowledge systems that produced them. I think that means devising different, more fluid and subtle data classification systems, but perhaps also forms of visualization that can express multiple perspectives, changing timescales, and multivocality. In my sense, speaking to people who specialize in database design is that they actually do understand these challenges to representing information and feel these challenges as keenly as we do. So the question is, what do we do? Like, do we build ever more detailed data models, like a Borgesian map, or do we develop conventions to express some of this complexity without trying to recreate it? And I have found some intriguing possibilities for interesting and perceptive ways of working with data that I wanted to mention briefly before I close. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with Maori information professionals on the Maori subject headings, which is an alternative system for classifying objects, alternative to the Library of Congress subject headings, designed to accommodate Maori knowledge. For example, the Library of Congress subject headings categorize a spacecraft as a subcategory of rocketry, which is a subcategory of aeronautics, which is a subcategory of communication and traffic. The Maori subject headings list a spaceship as a subcategory of waka, which can mean canoe, but also a conveyance in general, and much more than that, since the Maori are legendary navigators. So that's what a waka atea spacecraft is, according to Maori knowledge. It's a canoe for the stars. Maori subject headings are also interesting because of the way that they're encoded. They have to be made interoperable with Library of Congress subject headings, so they're encoded as nested structures in XML, even though Maori knowledge doesn't necessarily work in quite that way. So the guiding metaphor that the Maori working group uses is tuku tuku, which is the name for a kind of weaving. The idea is one person stands on one side of the loom and the other person stands on the other. And the process of making Maori knowledge fit North American colonial knowledge structures is a similar form of push and pull, a back and forth between what made the most sense for Maori epistemology and what made the most sense for the system that had to accommodate this knowledge. What I find really useful is the sophistication with which the Maori community agreed to think about data. They know exactly what they're doing. They understand that data is useful and telling in certain ways and can certainly be of practical utility, but they also understand that knowledge resides somewhere else, in this case, in traditional Maori modes of knowledge transmission. So in this model, data is invited as a participant to the dialogue, but never with more authority than the community itself. We can see a similar move among a growing set of scholars of what's sometimes called Black data. I'm thinking of a lot of scholars: Shaka McLaughlin, Tressie McMillan-Cottom, Jessica Marie Johnson, Simone Brown, Gabrielle Foreman, Sophia Noble, Mark Anthony Neal, and Mimi Onuoha, and more every day. What I see in the way that these thinkers are treating data is that, in McLaughlin's words, Black people and Black queer people in particular are hailed by big data in the sense of being pathologized and criminalized by it, but also depend on being able to wield data in order to demonstrate, for example, the ongoing effects of housing discrimination or wealth disparities. Mimi Onuoha has compiled missing data sets, such as the people denied public housing due to criminal records, asking us to consider how much data exists to criminalize and condemn minoritized communities. And yet, even in this avalanche of data, glaring blank spots prevent us from speaking truth to power. Recently, the information studies scholars Roderick Crooks and Morgan Curry elaborated in great detail on this ambivalence of minoritized communities to data. They argue that activists from these communities have learned to adopt what Crooks and Curry call an agonistic approach to data. When they use this term, they mean that minoritized groups use data to make arguments and mobilize collective action. But they also recognize that data has the potential to cause great harm to system-impacted communities. I think that these approaches handle data's relationship to reality with a depth of understanding and a reflexive skepticism within the community that isn't in evidence in the reception of a lot of mainstream statistical work. They understand immediately that no matter how good your data is, it's not going to capture everything. And they've developed modes of working with and building from that essential mismatch. I think we can learn a lot from this, although I want us, of course, to be wary of taking an extractive approach to the knowledge that these communities have developed. Instead, I think we can all benefit from explicitly recognizing these ways of working with data as the sophisticated and nuanced approaches that they are, and elevating the scholars who are practicing them so that they can lead the way. So I really like thinking about these questions with an audience invested in the humanities and data, because to me, this is actually a really exciting and fun thing to think about. And I'm hoping it was, to some extent, exciting and fun for you. So thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions, should you have any. Also accept just, like effusive praise, if you want to do that. Sometimes limericks are okay. Personal questions, advice, like if you have a romantic conundrum, I'm happy to take that on as well. Thanks, James and Luann. I'm also very happy to share slides. I think the talk was actually recorded, so I can go back and just luxuriate in my vocal fry.
This is Mike. I'm going to ask you a question. I was thinking some about kind of more modern computing techniques, which are dealing more with kind of NoSQL unstructured data and using kind of algorithms and machine learning, and where there aren't so much kind of human beings designing data structures, but instead pointing computers at these raw materials and then trying to discern patterns from those. And I'm wondering, does a lot of your critique seems to talk about the activity of structuring things and the assumptions that are built into those structures that are required to build databases. And I'm wondering if there's a different critique that you might levy at the machine learning approach to making sense of messy data.
Oh yeah, that's something I've thought about too. Also, if you look at like topic modeling or any kind of unsupervised machine learning, you'll find a similar kind of categorization system where the computer finds similarities. And there is something intriguing about that, and generative can be very generative. But I think to believe that it is somehow naive to already existing systems of categorization would be, a pretty profound error, because we've seen all the ways in which what gets fed into the machine is itself kind of parsed and derived from human bias in the first place. And then, of course, it's divided up, for example, tokenized in ways that are congenial to usually like Western ways of thinking about words in the first place. So yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I have had a lot of fun kind of playing with it, but it unfortunately in my mind doesn't get us out of that problem. And I see that Mary Mahoney had a good question here. Do you think there's an openness in fields like health and health humanities increasingly reliant, oh, that's a good question, on platforms like MyChart to rethink the way they record data of subjective issues like pain in the form of pain scales? Well, that's a fascinating question. I would kind of have to defer to people who know better than I do what's going on in my chart. I've certainly seen a good deal of concern from doctors and people in allied fields about the way in which patient data gathered in these enterprise platforms is used to do a kind of machine learning. We've seen lots of examples of outcomes that repeat the bias that brought us here in the first place. That's not your question, though. The question was about pain scales. I don't know. It's a great question. I would love to hear if anyone has an idea about how that might be done. And I see that Eugene Owens asks, since it all goes into computers and is digitized just for the sake of transmission and communication, doesn't it all seem academic, the distinction of what is and what isn't data? i.e., everything is data, isn't it? Yes, that's the issue. Everything is data, except if you talk to a humanist, lots of stuff isn't data. That's the problem. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to ask an art historian about their data and ask them to call Whistler paintings data. The fact is that there is, among many people who work with humanities artifacts, a really strong aversion to calling their sources by that name. And we have two options. We could say that they are diluted, right? Because everything is data. Or we could say that they've latched on to something kind of interesting, which is the fact that data refers to a process of meaning making that is not all encompassing, that there's another way to make meaning.
So I'm looking at the time. I see we have one, and Josh has suggested that we should try to be punctual because people may have to get on with their lives. But we have one last question, and I think I'm going to break the rules and suggest that maybe you take Luann's final question, and then we will we'll call it a day.
Oh, this is a good question. Luann wants to know from you're thinking that text mining and analysis would be secondary to humanistic research methods because she understood what I was saying to mean that like, yeah, we can do text mining, but we shouldn't think of it as the be all and end all. Now that you ask the question so explicitly, I'm not really sure what the answer is. I think that the best computational humanities scholarship I've seen does kind of toggle back and forth between computational approaches to the text and traditional humanistic modes of considering meaning. So it's, one might say it's dialectical. So there's a kind of push and pull between what the machine is telling us and what our intuition or what decades of scholarship have told us. What I noticed though, thinking about like Maori data and Black data is that it wasn't so much the presentation of the data that mattered, it was the understanding among the community members that mattered. Like they knew. So there exists a kind of literacy among members of the community that doesn't always exist within larger communities. So I wonder if what we're talking about is really an effort to educate people better on the limitations of data. So I hope that helps a little bit.
So thank you everybody for attending. Miriam actually gave this talk in the spring at Middlebury, and it was great then, and it's even greater now. I can see that your thinking has really advanced. So thank you so much. For folks that would like to see it again, we will send the link around for the video. And this so concludes our program for the day and for the fall. Thanks again, Miriam. Thank you.
Everybody, I really enjoyed getting to talk to you.